Hey there, folks. It's Javier here coming to you live. Let's see if I can kind of wrap this up in 10 minutes. So, today I did an off-camera interview, and the reason it was off-camera was because, out of respect for them, they didn't want to be on camera in the interview. However, I spoke to this white Minnesotan couple, and they were kind of like, I say, middle-aged. They have children, and they're native Minnesota residents. They've been here in this state for a very, very long time. Very long time. And they raise their kids here. They, hockey, whatever they do here during the winter sports, whatever. And they were probably coming out. They were apparently coming out of a game or something, or something. They were wearing sports jerseys for some Minneapolis team or whatever. These people I met, first of all, they were no fan of Tim Walz. That's one question I asked them. I'll just say that straight up. They say they both told me they can't wait for Tim Walz to get out of there. But they said some interesting stuff. I wanted to say, delve a little bit into what they said. I asked them, first of all, I started the conversation by asking them about, about the whole protest and Renee Nicole Good and all that stuff. And the whole thing, and I told them both sides, both sides of the whole ordeal, if you will. And obviously both sides of that included the fact that that from what I understood about it was the fact that the right was demonizing all the protesters. The right obviously was demonizing the protesters, saying they're all rioters, etc., etc. And then I guess the left or whatever, or maybe the more moderate, or just people who are reporting more honestly, were acknowledging that these people out there, so-called protesters, were actually looking out for each other, caring for each other, giving each other water, giving each other food, etc., 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 and actually being there, for each other as a community. And what I've come to discover is that from talking to these people, that they told me that both were true. That there were indeed a lot of rioters. They acknowledged that they don't like to, go by what the right-wing media says only, and which I respected deeply. So they actually kind of saw both sides of this, being Minnesota residents and Minneapolis residents and residents of this area. They saw both sides of this. So they acknowledged that both were true. Yes, there were, according to them, there were rioters during the whole Renee Nicole Good situation. But at the same time, there were also, a lot of very peaceful protesters and people looking out for each other and giving each other water and giving each other food and setting up stands and even praying for each other and all that stuff. And honestly, that other half, which is the other half that I came to understand, when I remember this happening, it sounded to me like some kind of Christian revival. I'm not even kidding, because when I think about Christian revival, I think about people coming together and loving one another and caring for one another and being there for each other, etc., etc. And that's what Minneapolis was doing. They came together, they showed support for each other, they looked out for each other as a community, they looked out for their immigrant neighbors, whether Somalian, etc., etc. And they came out and supported one another, gave each other food and water, and set up prayer tables. Prayer tables! That was one I didn't even hear about. And they looked out for one another. So this couple, first of all, they acknowledged that both things were happening. One side was, yes, there were rioters and all that stuff, but there were probably less than those. They acknowledged that. And they also acknowledged that there were prayer tables and people caring for each other, looking out for each other, giving each other food and water, whatever, and actually looking out for each other as a community, which was a really beautiful thing. So that was the first thing I got into, and speaking to them. The second thing I got into was the whole Somali thing. I brought up, and if you want to see my interview with the actual Somali, you can actually look below, because that was an on-camera interview. But the second thing I brought up was the whole thing about the Somalis and like how they came here and were immigrants here, etc., etc., and how, I personally came here to speak to them, to get to know them, to actually talk to them, and to see them as human beings. And I mentioned to this couple that the Somalis I met were actually very, very, very kind people. And I'll testify that directly here in Minneapolis, that the Somalis that I've met were all very kind people, and they were very good-hearted people. And I'm so glad that I got to meet them in person, And I continued the conversation, but then they said, in response to that, they said, "Well, kindness is always good, but they did mention to me things that I didn't even know, things I wasn't really aware of, and I don't really know how much truth there is to this about the massive child care fraud that's going on, that's being run by these Somalian immigrants, allegedly being run by these Somalian immigrants." And I have to say allegedly. I know that I'm a content creator, and I don't even know, so it is allegedly. But allegedly, massive billions of dollars of child care fraud were being run by the Somalian immigrants. And they explained to me how it worked. They explained to me that what was going on was that these Somalis were setting up like fake child care centers all over the state of Minnesota and Minneapolis and whatever, and pretending that they were taking care of children to get government funding, when in reality there was no children. Now, I didn't know about this. I will grant you guys, I didn't know about this. I saw the stuff, Nick Shirley stuff, whatever, kind of overlooked it because he's just another guy that's being popularized by the right wing and all that. And I kind of stay away from that. But what I understood is that from what they told me is that these Somalis were setting up child care centers all over the state of Minnesota and Minneapolis and whatever, and there were actually no children. They were getting paid by the government. They were receiving money by the government per child being supposedly taken care of, and none of that was even happening. It was all fraud. It was all a lie. And apparently, allegedly, they were instead, in doing this, sending billions of dollars, somehow billions, I don't know how we got billions with a B, but billions of dollars to their home country in Somalia. And that's what I learned. That's what I came to understand. That's what they were telling me. Now, billions of dollars with a B being sent to Somalia, all fraud money, all child care fraud. And they did even mention cancer fraud or autism or whatever, different kind of fake businesses being set up in Somalia, claiming to care for people, whether it's like healthcare businesses, autism, childcare, etc., etc. And these were all scam businesses, all scam companies being run by these Somalians to send money back to Somalia. And this is what this Minnesota couple was telling me. Now, the whole thing is that obviously I can't prove any of this one way or another, but I did mention this to the Somalian guy I interviewed. But this is what they were telling me, and I was shocked. Honestly, I was shocked because I don't know how much of this is true or not. Now, I did question them. I did ask, how much of this was actually shut down, And then they told me that a good amount of these places and child care fraud places, Medicare fraud places, whatever, autism fraud, whatever it was, the government managed to shut a number of them down, a good amount of them down, but they're still out there and they're still going and they're still doing this stuff. And as long as they're here, they're going to continue to do this stuff. So this is their perspective. This is their perspective of what I came to understand from speaking to these white Minnesotans who are apparently really sick of this BS that's supposedly and allegedly going on in Minnesota. And then when I brought up Nick Shirley, actually they brought up Nick Shirley, but when I talked about Nick Shirley, I mentioned how Nick Shirley was very popular by the right, went viral, and then they kind of explained to me that supposedly, allegedly, Nick Shirley exposed this stuff. He allegedly exposed this stuff, and then this child care fraud, healthcare fraud, autism fraud, all this stuff, all this so-called fraud going on in Minnesota, that's allegedly, gathering billions of dollars and sending it back to Somalia, and. So apparently, when they brought up Nick Shirley, they said that Nick Shirley apparently exposed this fraud, and then after he exposed it, Nick Shirley had no intention of going viral, but he went viral anyway. And then I mentioned to them, Nick Shirley, I avoid him because he's very popularized by the right wing, and that's a red flag. And when I mentioned to them that I saw this Facebook group that really creeped me out, honestly, this Facebook group with it was called Nick Shirley, with Nick Shirley's face on it, with millions of members. And it's just shows how the right will just take some right-wing figure that's helping them, that's supporting their cause, especially a young man, a right-wing young man who's advancing their Charlie Kirk, sycophant, whatever cause, and run with it. So apparently Nick Shirley, allegedly, was this. Allegedly Nick Shirley was actually exposing this stuff like actually exposing the Somali fraud, but then the right kind of took him and ran with him and made him into this idol, made him into this famous Charlie Kirk-like conservative, whatever. And apparently that's what happened. Allegedly that's what happened. And that's how we went viral and got so popular, etc., and was never actually meant to be that way. He was just out there trying to supposedly expose this Somalian fraud going on. So I don't really know how much of this is true or not, but continuing on, it was just quite crazy, and they did mention that, Ellie and Omar, this couple believed that Ellie and Omar was eventually going to get busted for this herself, because they believe the Ellie and Omar was part of the fraud problem. And then I mentioned Omar Fatah, and then they mentioned that if Omar Fatah won that, and I did talk about a little bit that close mayor race that happened between Jacob Fry and Omar Fatah. And obviously Jacob Fry won the Minneapolis mayor election. Barely. That was the right wing's biggest victory in the midterms last year, the elections last year. The Jacob Fry defeat Omar Fatah, the more moderate candidate defeat the more progressive candidate barely. But they mentioned that if Omar Fatah had won, because apparently they supported Jacob Fry in this election, not saying in general, but apparently they said if Omar Fatah had won, then he would have been covering up all this fraud and having all these Somalis backs and all that stuff. So all this stuff, it's really chilling, honestly, if this is true. And then they mentioned that, we live in a country, and they, of course, these conservatives, they're conservative, obviously very conservative leaning, or seem to be. They mentioned that we live in a country with a rule of law, but these people, were apparently, okay, this couple mentioned that we live in a country that embraces the rule of law. Whereas these people that, are Somalians and they were doing fraud and all that stuff, or so allegedly, supposedly, I don't know if it's true or not. I don't know how much of it is true. There may be a lot of lies attached to this, which I acknowledge. But allegedly, these people that were doing fraud, that's how they live. That's their lifestyle. And then I kind of mentioned how similar this is to like the Nigerian-based scams, the Nigerian-based scams that constantly target Americans. And they said, yeah, it's very similar, but except it's happening here because they're here, physically here, and they're funneling billions of dollars and sending it back to their country, supposedly. And so I mentioned that, and then they said that if Omar Fatah had won that election and beat Jacob Fry, that he would have intentionally covered it all up because he's one of them and he's their people and all that stuff, which probably is one of the reasons why he lost, because maybe Minneapolis was scared of that. Maybe Minneapolis was scared he was going to be covering up fraud or whatever. So these are just their takes. And then we kind of talked about like the economy, and we talked about how like, the economy is like, crumbling and all that stuff, and prices are going up and fuel's going up, food, housing, college, etc. And they were like, yeah, this is going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And then we kind of like correlated on the whole concept of biblical times. Like we all, and I even brought up myself, like as a person of faith, and I did mention him, I am a person of faith, that we all know where this is going. We all know where this is going, like the Bible, the mark of the beast, all that stuff, the end times. And they agreed on that. So, and they obviously mentioned, like I said, Elian Omar, she said they think that she's eventually going to get exposed and arrested for fraud and all that stuff, and arrested for being part of this Somali fraud thing. And it was just quite an interesting talk. I really wish I got this on camera, but what was fascinating about this is kind of like seeing two sides of different coins. Like I interviewed the Somali immigrant, and that was interesting. That was powerful. And then I interviewed this white, a seemingly conservative-leaning couple, and they were talking about all the fraud and all that stuff. And I even talked to a police officer, aside from that, like briefly, inside a Walgreens, and then he said that like people were stealing stuff and all that, and they had to hide stuff, which was, I was just like, what? And it's just like, whoa. But it was really interesting. I'm not going to lie. So I got to see kind of both sides of the coin. Now that being said, every Somali I met here have been beautiful people, kind people, loving people, and I was so glad to meet them here in Minneapolis. And I was so proud to take this trip because this place really had a good place, has a powerful place on the map. Now, after that, we shook hands. And then we just kind of I said, thank you for the interview. Thank you for the food for thought. And thank you for inciting me and educating me and opening my mind to understanding this stuff firsthand from actual residents here. So it was very interesting. And I'm very glad that I got to do this interview. Now, aside from that, I'm going to throw this in real quick I did speak to a homeless lady here in Minneapolis. And she said that if you really want to get to know Minneapolis, visit the homeless shelters and see how badly they treat them, and actually go there. And I didn't actually do this, but she did recommend this. She said, if you really want to see Minneapolis, go to the homeless shelters and visit them and actually see how the people there are treated, apparently very badly, and go there acting like you need to have a place to stay and all that, and see how they treat you. And then that sent chilling stuff off me. So again, with the whole fraud thing, the whole Somalian fraud thing, I can't prove anything. I don't know how much of this is true. I personally think a lot of it has been spun by the right wing to make it worse than it sounds. I think a lot of it has been dishonestly spun, and I actually don't know what it's like to be, so all of that, I really do think that a lot of it has been dishonestly spun by the right wing, and that couple, as nice as they were, and they were very nice, were actually brainwashed themselves a little bit. But I don't know how much truth there is to that, or the whole homeless thing, or the stealing thing, or whatever. But it was quite interesting, and I was very glad to have visited. I'm proud to have done it. Anyways, these are my thoughts. Thank you for watching. This is Javier here, tuning out. Like and subscribe. Please follow me, subscribe to me, whatever. Like, comment, whatever. Tuning out. Thank you for watching. Take care.